So I've been listening to Joshua Sijuwade recently. He's a Christian apologist and a philosopher of religion. He's done work in philosophical theology, and he's a member of the Eastern Orthodox Church. And so I've really appreciated hearing how he articulates ideas in theology and philosophy. In particular, he has a framework for an exemplarist theodicy, and I just wanted to respond to that. So let's listen to it here.
Do you want to give us one of the main reasons that you draw?
Yeah, so I've developed myself what I call the Exemplarist Theodicy. So this is a work that's going to be published by Routledge within the next 2 months or so. Quite a comprehensive book on the problem of evil. And my main reason, which can be whittled down as sort of a elevator pitch sort of thing, is that God allows suffering for two reasons. Number one, to provide the possibility for individuals to transform into exemplars of morality. And then number two, to provide or to allow others to transform into exemplars of morality. So what I mean by that second one is, for those who don't go through the first one, the process of transforming to exemplar through their response to suffering, God is using them as opportunities for others to transform. And he will compensate them for that role that they fulfilled. So it's not that God is using them as a means to an end and just sort of discards them. But because they have, for whatever reason, not the ability to become exemplars, they are playing a role in transforming people into exemplars, and thus God will compensate them in the eternity, for that sort of position.
And
Okay, so first of all, the idea here that suffering is for the sake of an exemplar so that we can become these greater moral agents. There are a variety of issues with this. I think this, honestly, generally is a very weak response. The first reason is because one of the things he talks about is that virtues like courage wouldn't exist in a world without suffering. But, of course, the response to this should be, it wouldn't be necessary to have a virtue like courage in a world without suffering. So sure, it doesn't exist, but we would have no framework for that. We wouldn't need it because suffering doesn't exist, and that's entirely not necessary. So that's the first problem. But he talks here about how the suffering of someone could be an exemplar for somebody else, or at the very least, somebody else could see that and build their own moral fiber. Now, the problem with this is that even though he refers to it here and says that it's not though somebody is a means to an end, that's kind of what it sounds like. Because if one's own suffering doesn't offer them the possibility to become a greater moral agent, then they would have to be suffering for the sake of somebody else. But if that's the case, then they are simply a means to an end. A horrible but relevant example would be a child who is kidnapped, raped, and murdered. This child never has the opportunity to become a greater moral exemplar. So you might say, well, their suffering is for the sake of others, and maybe they'll be compensated in the afterlife. Well, for as far as we know here, it does seem as though that's just the child being a pawn in some greater scheme or a means to an end. And so their suffering really is, let's just say, unfair, to say the least. But even if there is some sort of greater compensation in the afterlife, well, that idea is based upon the assumption that this whole theory is true. The problem is that if it's not true, then this is really just this is just begging the question. So you have to make that assumption that it is true in order for it to make any sort of sense. However, just on the face of it, based on the information that we have at hand, that individual who undergoes a sort of heinous suffering doesn't get any sort of benefit from it themselves and are really just a means for somebody else to get some sort of benefit from it. So there are other problems with this, but let's just continue to listen for now.
I have a sense of what that looks like.
Yeah, the compensation.
Yeah.
Okay. Can I go through the first one?
Okay, go ahead. Yeah, then we'll get to
the
that
second one. So, well, with the first thing of saying transform into exemplars, the idea here is that God, before he creates the world, he has sort of the position in front of him that he can bring about a near infinite amount of worlds that are logically possible. A world where we exist, a world where we're talking, a world where we're not talking, a world where Hitler wins World War II, where he doesn't win World War II, and so on. There's infinite near amount of worlds. But one class of those worlds is a world where there is a moral structure. And we would say that God will want there to be morality within the world. A perfectly good God would not want a chaotic moral world world where people are just doing evil without any moral sort of guidance. Now, there are two types of world that God can bring about when he's deciding to bring about that moral structured world. He can decide to bring about a world that is just determined by him morally, a world where he just puts forward the Ten Commandments but writes it even more deeply in the hearts of everyone, such that they're in a sort of automated way just doing the good. So I do good because it's written within me that I must do it, and so I'm automatically doing the good. And so what God has in that sort of world is a world where he creates the world physically himself, that's his own work, but then also he establishes the world axiologically, that means morally, by himself as well. So he makes the world into what it is, but he also makes the world into a good world just from his own doing. But the second type of world is one where God creates the world physically, but he leaves the world to be created axiologically by others. So he leaves it to other people to make the world into a good world instead of him just making the world into a good by himself. And so what I mean by that is, in sort of this world where there's an exemplarist structure, is that God creates individuals with the ability to become exemplars of morality. An exemplar is someone that you point to as an admirable person. You look to them and say, they are good. They are, and we can think about many people, people come into our minds about, oh, this was a good person. And the thing about admirability is that we emulate those who are admirable. We look to them and say, we want to be like them. Now, so some of your audience who might be into football, you have that debate with Messi and Ronaldo. Well, that's an admirable person. If you're a football sort of a fanatic and you want to be a player, you'll say, oh, I like Ronaldo, I want to be like him. So what you try to do, you try to train like him, eat like him, dress like him, you try to become like him. Now, over time, if you have the ability, you become close to being like Ronaldo. Well, it's the same with goodness. When we look to people who are admirable for their goodness, over time, if we try to be like them, live like them, act in the way that they act, we become like them over time.
So I want to pause to address this idea, because part of the issue, one of the various issues, is that not all suffering results in some sort of moral benefit or moral growth. There are many cases where terrible things happen, and that's kind of the end of it. Again, as horrible of an example as it is, this child who is taken and ultimately killed, this child never benefits from it. And my question would be, what is it from the outside that anybody is seeing that helps them to grow? Like, what in this situation is causing them to gain more moral fiber? Perhaps you could argue that there is something, but again, this just seems like a very strange argument. There's no growth in this situation. It's just that once this terrible thing happens, it's basically over, and that's the end of it.
The way that God has structured the world in the second world is that God leaves it such that people, through their experiences, become exemplars. And then other people look to them and say, I want to be like them, and then seek to emulate them. And then over time, they become exemplars themselves. And so over time, it's like sort of a wildfire with a match that's been lit. That just one person becomes an exemplar that leads to another, leads to another. And then over time, we have a world that becomes a good world. But how the world has become good, epistemically, through sort of the way we've lived and experientially, is through exemplars of morality. And so over time, what we have...
So another problem is, if this were the case, then it seems that all suffering should be equal. It should be the same for everybody. However, there are many people who undergo vastly greater suffering than others, many who undergo very, very little suffering compared to others. So it seems sort of arbitrary how much suffering any given person experiences throughout their life. And that doesn't really make sense on this idea of what he's saying here. Suffering, if it is necessary for us building our moral character and building the type of world that God would want to be built, there should be some sort of uniformity there, but there isn't.
It's a world where God creates the world himself, but we are able to participate in his creative function by making the world good through ourselves. And so what I say in some way is that suffering is a necessary ingredient for those to become exemplars of morality. So God allows us to flourish in the great...
This is key as well. So he's saying that it's a necessary ingredient. If this is the case, then that would mean that God is not omnipotent, at least not in the classical sense. See, you have to imagine that if a omnibenevolent and omnipotent God existed, then it seems that this God could have created a world wherein there is no suffering at all, and we still had some sort of free will. That's generally the response to this issue, is free will is required, and therefore this suffering that exists in the world is required as well. But if indeed this God were omnipotent, then it seems that there is some way that this God could have created a world where we have both free will and no suffering. Now, perhaps that is the case, and like Joshua here is saying, that it is necessary for the suffering to exist in order for our great moral character to be built. Well, then that simply means that God is incapable of creating a world in which there is no suffering and there is also great good. And there are different responses to this. So there are sort of neoclassical ways of thinking about God's omnipotence and God's power, but just based on what he's saying here, you can't have a classical God who is truly omnipotent and say that this suffering is required, because by definition, if it is required, then there is no other possible thing that could exist. And so that just seems to demonstrate that God is constrained or limited in some way.
This way by becoming exemplars of morality, but in order to do that, we need to undergo suffering experiences. That sort of fits in there.
Yeah, say I get how some suffering is needed for me to grow in my character. I get how some trials, I get how some decisions as to whether I'm going to shoplift or not, these are needed to grow my character. But is so much suffering needed? Is the Holocaust needed? Was the Black Death needed, etc.? What do you say to that objection?
Yeah, so what I would say is that the intensity of suffering is a real issue as well, and that's the main issue for a lot of what we call theodicies, explanations for why God allows suffering or evil. And what I would say within my theodicy, the exemplarist theodicy, is that the intensity or severity of suffering is sort of a necessary component as well for this exemplarist transformative process, and it is for two reasons. The first reason is the more that you suffer, the more intense your suffering, the deeper you have of the virtues that you acquire. So the more fear that I'm going through in relation to a suffering experience, the more courage that I would need. The more harder the experience that I'm going through, the more patience I would need. The more harder or difficult the suffering of my friend or my daughters or my family member they're going through, the more compassion I would need compared to more less severe suffering. So the more suffering that you experience or others experience, the more ingrained or deeper the virtue that you're acquiring you're going to have.
So the point that the interviewer makes, this question is a profoundly important point here. This response, again, is inadequate. The two things that he mentioned before are, one, the suffering is required for our own moral benefit. And if that is not the case, then it's for the sake of someone else's moral benefit. And what he's saying here is the greater the suffering, the greater the moral benefit. But again, there are many situations where that's not the case. To return to the really terrible example previously, this child doesn't get any benefit from this situation. There is no opportunity to build in moral fiber. And again, I'm questioning what it is that would cause others on the outside to gain moral character from it. But even if they did, let's say that that is the case, this is just the child being used as a pawn, a means to an end. And so on both of the grounds that he stipulates at the beginning, this is an insufficient response.
That experience. And so the great exemplar you'll become. Think about those who we put as bastions of morality and goodness. What type of suffering did they need to go through? Think of those who, the abolitionist movement.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer,
all
something
those
like
sort of
that,
people, they
give
went
his
through
life.
great
Yeah.
suffering, and they are the ones that we look to as great exemplars. The second thing as well is about motivation. So the more someone goes through suffering as an exemplar, the more admirable they become to that person. And so the more I'm motivated to go and look and to try and be like them. Think about all those people who did survive the Holocaust. We look at that and say, those were some of the greatest people who overcame and tried to live through that scenario. So they are the ones that we then say, we want to be like them. And we want to fight this sort of Nazistic thinking that it never comes again. And so the two things I'm saying is the greater the suffering, the greater the hold you have of a virtue, such that you become I would say.
Again, that argument doesn't make any sense at all, because there are many people who never had the opportunity to grow morally. There were probably many people, as hard as it is to say, that died terribly in the Holocaust who perhaps crumbled in fear in their final moments, and it wasn't anything that we would necessarily say is worthy of a moral exemplar. We certainly shouldn't criticize people such as that because of how horrible that situation was, and any one of us could be the same. The point being, this isn't required, and it doesn't necessarily come about as a response to something like that. So I just want to summarize with a few points as to why this argument is weak, insufficient, wholly inadequate. The idea of the existence of certain virtues, such as courage, wouldn't be necessary in a world wherein there is no suffering. If suffering is required, necessary for our moral development, then that simply means that God is constrained in some way and cannot be considered this classically omnipotent God. And so this is a possibility, but it opens up other issues and sort of shifts the significance of this discussion. We also have to acknowledge that not every sort of suffering results in some sort of moral benefit. There are lots of cases where things happen, something terrible happens, and either a person's life is ended or that's just the end of it, and nobody gains from that. But even if this were the case, and in every sort of suffering there was some benefit from it, then there are clearly some examples where certain individuals are merely means to an end, and they themselves don't actually get any benefit except for some supposed compensation in an afterlife that may or may not exist. But you have to presuppose that afterlife in order for any of this to make any sense. Another issue is the matter of the lack of uniformity. If suffering were required for our moral benefit, then it should be the same for everybody. There shouldn't be this arbitrary difference and vast difference in how people around the world suffer. If it were built into the system of our world, then we should have the same suffering all throughout humanity. And kind of another aspect of that piece of it is that there is no need for heinous evil or heinous suffering in order for our moral fiber to be built. There are ways that morality can be developed in ways that come from a response to very minor suffering, or maybe even what could be called a medium level or mediocre suffering. But it's certainly not necessary to have tremendous atrocities for us to have this moral fiber and moral benefit. There are certainly people around the world who are either unaware of it and have never experienced it themselves that still develop a level of moral fiber and great moral character. So for all these reasons, as much as I enjoy listening to Dr. Sijuwade and appreciate his articulation of a lot of things, this really is an insufficient theodicy, and I think Christian apologists certainly would need to do better.